Okay, good morning, good morning. Okay. Making sure I have it on the right page. So we left off last week. We're in the book of Hebrews, and we're going to just kind of jump into class. We're in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 2, and we were coming to the end of I think verse 8. Let me pull that up. Makes it hard because when I have this on the screen, I have to choose between this or other things. So, okay. So Hebrews 2, verses 8. So we had just talked about, I'll go back up to verse 5. He's been making a point that he's been making since chapter 1. What is the point? Jesus has a greater name and is better than angels. Okay, so that's from like verse 4 of chapter 1. And then he starts stacking the arguments, laying the case, and trying to present his argument. And he's doing a really good job. And so he gets to, we've passed a bunch of things and the way that he's gone about talking about them. But when you open up to chapter 2, the first few verses are kind of him speaking again what he spoke on in the first few verses of chapter 1, which is namely, God spoke through prophets in many different times, in many different ways, and yet in these last days he spoke through his Son. And so you're supposed to listen to Jesus. And then in chapter 2, it opens like this. For this reason, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, so we do not drift away from it. For if the word spoken through angels proved unalterable, and every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? So what did we say he's talking about there when he says, if the word spoken through angels were proven unalterable and every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty? What was that talking about? The Mount Sinai. It's talking about the law of Moses. Now, you and I are not Jews, so we don't recognize that. We don't recognize that kind of talk. But we spent a lot of class time last week discussing that point, because his point is, at Mount Sinai, and the Jews in general realized that there were these verses we covered last week, that angels were involved in the handing over of the law to Moses. We spent a long time last week. You can ask for notes if you didn't catch that. But when he descended upon Mount Sinai, a heavenly host of all of his angels accompanied him. Then you have Paul referencing and here in Hebrews as well, that the angels were a part of the handing off of the law of Moses to Moses. We don't know exactly how that works. What you get from that is this. He is making a point. If you are severely punished for disobeying the law, the old law, the law of Moses, and he says, if the word spoken through angels proved unalterable. So let's just say it's synonymous with the Old Testament and the old law. And every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty. How will we escape if we neglect a great salvation? So his point is, another reason that we need to really pay attention to this, that he has demonstrated his point. And then he opens chapter 2 up with, because Jesus is more supreme and he is better than the angels, for this reason we must pay closer attention to what we have heard so we do not drift away from it. Because if you're a Hellenistic Jew, you may think, I don't think Jesus is it, and I don't think he's enough. Or, I think the old law still has a place in my heart. And the Hebrew writer says, it doesn't. Not in the sense that you elevate anything above Jesus. His words must matter the most. His words, by the way, were in the old law. His words were a part of the law of Moses. He's going to go on to continue to explain these things. So if Jesus is greater than angels, and the words of the angels were punished tremendously if you didn't obey them, we get a really good insight into that into the first couple of chapters in the New Testament, right? When Zechariah doesn't listen to the angel, or he kind of says, "Who are you? How am I to believe this?" Did it prove that the angels had great authority in that moment to make him understand the power of God that they were sent with? Yes, right? Well, apply that same idea to angels giving a part of the old law to Moses. They're saying, if it is that exacting, and you tremble at the idea of keeping the word of God through the law of Moses, but Jesus is greater than angels, then you should really take heed to his words, right? That's what he says. Because not only did Jesus provide this truth to us through the New Testament, he sacrificed himself in order for you to be saved. And he's going to get into that as well, that's the part of his supremacy, is Jesus did something that no angels did and that no one else did. And therefore, he deserves your full attention and respect when he gives his words. Okay, so that catches us up. So he starts going back in about which of the angels did he subject the world to come, and he didn't. He didn't do any of that in verse 5. But one has testified somewhere saying, this is verse 6, "What is man that you remember him, or the son of man that you are concerned about him? You have made him a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, and you've appointed him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet." And so we were talking about the fact that this is the Psalm verse 8. Psalm 8, and what we hear in Psalm 8 and understand of it is that originally it was tied to this idea of Adam and how he was the first man. That's how they understood it. All things were in subjection under his feet. He had dominion over the animals, and he was to rule over. And who is he that God should care about him and the rest of who came from Adam and Eve? Who are we? And, that's how they applied it in the Old Testament. But here, he's making the point that it really doesn't, we don't fulfill this. That we don't fully fulfill Psalm 8. But we do see someone who does fulfill Psalm 8. That's his shift right here. That's what he's shifting to. Oh, I don't know if my pin disconnected. You see it right there at the beginning that we do see him who was made for a while lower than angels, namely Jesus. And so we understand that he is now making the point that Jesus fulfills that in Psalm 8. And he's going to be making that point pretty much for a little while here. So let's see here. The writer quotes the Septuagint when he's saying the word angels, while the Hebrew text says the word Elohim, translated God or gods, but it's likely meaning the mighty beings in Psalm 8. So the mighty beings of Psalm 8 refer to the angels. Then the writer of Hebrews is still developing this comparison between Christ and the angels that began in Hebrews 1. And he's being made lower than the angels in one sense, which is that he took on flesh, but proved himself ultimately greater than they. So you have put all things in subjection under his feet. This applies in Psalm 8 to Jesus and his incarnation and his exaltation, because what he is trying to say is all things have not really been made subject to mankind, not in the same way that Jesus has fulfilled them. But the writer insists that Jesus has fulfilled this when he has conquered sin and death, and he is the one who has the power over death, which would be that old serpent himself who has been biting at the heels of man since the garden, and which he seems to be quite effective at dominating us. Who in the world can say that we have dominion over things like sin and death and Satan? Are those things in subjection to you and me? Well, at the time of Psalm 8, you would say, no, not really. No one's really conquering that or thinking that they're conquering that. And yet, when Jesus comes, he fulfills it in the greatest sense. It was only during the days of Christ's earthly life that he was made lower than the angels. It's a statement that speaks to his true humanity. I think that's something people overlook. Jesus is needing to be claimed to be lower than the angels. Not that he's no longer God, because we know he is, but that it speaks to his ultimate humanity, the human side of Jesus. And that then makes him lower than the angels in the sense that he had to put on flesh, which angels did not do. And in order to put on flesh, he had to have blood, and he had to have a body prepared for him. And that means he's not just spirit, which means he could die, right? And that in some regard could be seen as lower than beings who could not die. Okay? And so there is that. I think when you hear that, you need to see it as a temporary status that Jesus put on flesh. Angels didn't do that, which makes him in some sense a little lower than they. But because of how he lived faithfully, obediently during the days of his flesh, even in the times of suffering, Jesus was crowned with glory and honor. And that's what we see here. It says, but we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. See, that's his direct point of talking about little lower, or a little while lower than the angels, is he directly says, because of the suffering of the death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Angels didn't die for people. They never have. They've never claimed to. They never could. But God, in this glorious work that he has done, has found a way to give up himself for his own creation. And because of this, he has inherited a more excellent name than the angels when he was enthroned as son or king at God's right hand. Hebrews 1:3, Hebrews 1:13. It was only then that literally all things were put in subjection under his feet, as the psalm declares. When Jesus tasted death and then became the perfect author of their salvation, that is when all things were put in subjection under his feet. Because that is when the Father says, after he gives him all authority, and Jesus says to his disciples, all authority in heaven and on earth have been given to me. And then he goes and he ascends back to the Father, and he, basically this image of kicking up his feet, he sits down. And God says, or the Father says, sit down until I put all the enemies in subjection under your feet. And it's just this continual ruling over everything. So this is the main argument here, that all things were to be in subjection to this person in Psalm 8. And what he is claiming is that person is Jesus. That's what he's trying to say. The main argument here, the word subject is used in Hebrews 2, verse 5, Hebrews 2, verse 7, and Hebrews 2, verse 8. It's Christ who has been appointed over the works of God's hand. And verse 7, and also has put all things in subjection under his feet. Not the angels. It is Christ who fulfills Psalm 8, not angels. So whether they thought it was Adam, or they read it and with the Septuagint it changes from this mighty beings that was stated in Psalm 8. The whole point is, whoever they thought it was about, the full fulfillment of it was Jesus. That's what his point is. Verse 10. For it was fitting for him for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. The writer sees Jesus as a precursor or a forerunner to all other people who will live faithfully as he did. That's what he sees him as. He goes first, and they all follow behind. That is what Jesus, let's clear some of this up. That's what Jesus is doing. He is trying to bring many sons to glory. That's what he's doing. And to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. That's what Jesus went through in order to do this. So we get to be brought to glory, and he got to be brought to shame and a cross. That's a part of what's being said here, and that's what he just said all up here. But look, he is first crowned with glory. When he is crowned is when he's suffering immensely on the cross and all the things that happened to him, so that the grace of God, and by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. You say, how is it the grace of God that he tastes death? Wrong. Read the whole verse. So that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. The grace was not for Jesus in that moment, it was for you. Because he was looking at Jesus on the cross and going, oh God, you're so graceful. That was God. It was his choice. He did not save the grace for himself. He poured it out for you. And that's important. Okay? So that he could bring many sons and daughters to glory. And he could crown them as well with salvation. So, let's see here. Verses 11 through 12 says, for both he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are all from one Father, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I'll proclaim your name to my brethren. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And so we'll look at that. Because Christ lived in the flesh lower than the angels, because that's where we're at. We are lower than the angels. You don't get confused and say, an angel, we're on same level here. We know that because when an angel ever shows itself to a person in the older New Testament, how does a human react? They're in awe. They're scared. They are trembling. They realize that it is something greater than themselves. Now, that's just an angel. So imagine what we are and how undone we are, like Isaiah and like Daniel and these other people who get a glimpse into the throne room of God himself. Undone. Undone. Because he's the one who made angels, right? So the one who makes angels is much, much greater than they. And what he's saying is because Christ lived in the flesh lower than the angels, he is of the same nature as those he's trying to sanctify, not angels, right? It's a part of the way that Jesus is showing us and the text is showing us. Jesus is not trying to become like angels. He went way lower. He's trying to become like you and me so that he could sanctify us and be offered as a sacrifice for us. And that's something that angels never did. The writer then gives scripture to show what he means by verse 11. He cites Psalm 22, verse 22, and Isaiah, that would be this one down here, Isaiah 8:17. through 18 to demonstrate this commonality we share with our Savior. Christ can call human beings both brothers in Hebrews 2:11 through 12 and children in Hebrews 2:13 through 14. Both brothers and children describe those who belong to the same family, in this case, the family of flesh, our humanity. Okay? So although it may seem like a negative that he was made lower than angels, the fact that he chose the status of humanity, of this weak flesh of his own, for our sake, in order to properly sanctify us, shows his greatness, not his inferiority, right? He put on the flesh and lived it perfectly. So what started off as seemingly lowering himself below angels, he's done something that no one else could. He lived perfectly in the flesh, then raises him far above any other name, right? And all of that is restored to its proper position. This, of course, was the plan of God all along. Verse 14, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, and he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil. So we're down here. We're right here, kind of jumped a little bit. Since the children share in flesh and blood, and he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil. So Christ became flesh and blood so that as a human being, he could destroy the one who had the power of death hanging over all of humans' heads. Namely, that is the devil. Hebrews 2:14. He is this person who had the power of death, who's wielding the power of death. And so Jesus comes and he says, well, if you're going to wield the power of death, then I'm going to destroy death. I'm going to take that power from you. I'm going to change this. And that's what he did. This is how death was made subject to him, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 8. Not only did he nullify the devil's hold on man by conquering death, but he died a redemptive sacrificial death for all of us. So he ended the devil's ability to wield death without anyone having a say in it. He took death from Satan and said, no longer will you hurt the people with this. No longer will you hold this over their head. Death will be conquered. So that's everyone going forward. But what he also did is through his death, it was redemption. And it was a sacrifice going forward and backwards for all who had suffered from death. Now, of course, what does death come from? Yeah, right? Sin. So Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. So it's like anytime you're having a conversation about the devil's hold with death, how he has this power to use it, what are we really talking about? Talking about sin. Sin is always in the picture of that scenario. Because if you were to live a perfect life without sin and you die, you're still okay. You're still fine. We say that often about children, about babies. You haven't sinned. And in that regard, you're still in this space of a creation which has not stumbled yet. Therefore, you go and you're still with God. But once you sin, the devil has you. And then death becomes your greatest enemy, right alongside the devil. And you can't take a shower hot enough. You can't donate enough charity. You can't help enough people to even cover one sin. So the devil just says, I got you. And the horrifying realization is everyone is going to fall short of the glory of God. Therefore, death and the devil, they have this dance that utterly destroys us. And Jesus says, we're done with that. We're done with that. So, verse 15 and 16. I think also a part of this is he partook of the same. He's building up a case for something here. If you know the book of Hebrews, maybe you'll know what he's building up. But why is there power in him partaking of the same? He just made a point that Jesus is like you, right? He has flesh and blood like you. And then he has to back up and say, but he's not like you in the fact that he sinned. He didn't do that, which made him able to sanctify you and to be sacrificed for you. But when it gets down here and he's talking about, therefore, since the children share in the flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same. Why is that powerful in a conversation about through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death? Why is it powerful that Jesus was like you, sharing flesh and blood when he defeated Satan?
Hebrews 4:15, it says, "For we do not have a priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin."
Yes.
So to think that in the past, in order for anyone to go before the throne of God, they had to go through the priest.
Yes.
And now Jesus has done away with that, and he has opened the throne of heaven to us.
Yes.
So we can talk directly to God, and we can go, if you read the next scripture, it talks about how we can draw near with confidence to the throne of grace so that we may receive mercy and we find grace to help in time of need. And then there's other scriptures that talk about Jesus being our mediator because he's been through what we've been through. He's been tempted like we have.
Yes.
So it's not just God up there and us down here.
Yes.
And no empathy at all
Yes.
because nobody knows what you've been through. Christ can look at the Father when we go to his throne and be like, I know what this feels like.
Yes.
It's a horrible feeling.
Yes.
This is what they're going through. And that empathy from deity, from somebody who created us, just shows the love of God and how much care he has for us.
Amen. So, verses just right following it, he is going to bring up this idea of faithful priest, okay? And so that he might become a faithful priest. And so he's building this case already early. He's building this case just a verse back saying, Jesus was like you when he defeated Satan. He was in flesh and blood. And a part of that was because he was coming to save you. If he wanted to save the pigs, he would have come and became a pig. If he wanted to save angels, he would come and become an angel. And the part of Hebrews' argument is he came for you. He came for you, and he's about to bring that out more and more. But he's also showing that he is the perfect high priest. And that's something that we have never heard in the New Testament yet, right? That has not been said in the New Testament. This would have been something that they are going, whoa, I've heard he's a king. I've heard he's a prince. I've heard these other things said about Jesus. But he's a priest as well. He's my priest. And to a Jew, would that be very comforting in a way? Yeah, I think so. You've abandoned all these things that you knew as your only way of life. That you had this high priest that you came to, and this is the way that you sacrificed, and you said, now I know that my sins are washed away. This is the way God wanted it. And now you're a Hellenistic Jew, or a Jew who is trying to wrestle with the cross and with Jesus and saying, we're done with Judaism, and I get that, but I'm still clinging to some of these things. And then the Hebrew writer says, Jesus is your high priest. Oh, well, that's wonderful. And he says exactly how he's your high priest and how he can understand you like a priest could, like the priests in the Old Testament could. Brethren, you would come to a high priest and he's the same as you. He's got the same flesh and blood as you. And you're confessing and you're giving these things on the altar and you're saying, please, get this, atone for me. Put this up and send it to God. I've sinned. And they're not just sitting there looking at them like, we never sin. They also sinned. the priests also sinned. They were not perfect. So there was a comfort in having a priest and a high priest. We're talking Old Testament. Don't think Catholic here. We're talking Old Testament. That sat at the altar that could understand and relate to your sins, right? That you could look and say, I've sinned again, and I need your help. I need you to take this to God. Well, now we have a perfect high priest, and he is our sacrifice to God. And so we'll keep reading with some of this. So, and might, well, let's read this in order here. So that had, he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. Okay, so this brings up another point that we just kind of talked about, which is they feared death. All these people who have sinned and lived a life where death is a great enemy. And he would free them through the fear of who through the fear of death were subject to slavery. So the devil was able to hold this death over their heads all their lives. And use it to shame them, use it to make them do other things. How does Satan wield the idea that you are a lost person, that you have sinned, you have failed God, and that death is imminent for you, that you deserve to die? Let's say, how would the devil take Romans 6:23, the first part, and say the wages of sin is death, and use it against people? What is one of the most common things that we do if we sin once and we do something and we do a heinous sin that we've never done before, but we've done it once? Pray. Sure. Absolutely. But what is a tendency that happens when you do a heinous sin that you've never done before?
Feel like a failure.
Sure. Absolutely. Is it easier to do it again? Oh. If you break open sin and you do it once, the devil says, let's do that again. Let's do that again. Let's do that again. Let's do that again. And all of a sudden you realize, I don't feel as bad about it anymore. So then there's another heinous sin, and you do that. And then the devil says, let's do that again. Let's do that again. What that comes from, I think, is the shame. So you sin once, Romans 6:23. You're done. You're dead. You deserve to die. That's a hard message without the other half of Romans 6:23, but the devil doesn't keep the Bible in context. So he's going to emphasize that to you. You're toast. God says, I'm done with you. To hell with you. And then you say, well, then we better make it count. Right? That's what sinful people do. That's what we do. It's what Christians do at times. In the sense that when you're stumbling and you do a sin that you've been on your knees 400 times doing, on that 401st time you say, well, better enjoy it a little more before I pray. Same thing. It's the same trap. We just should know better. It's how Satan wields sin and death and shame. He says, you've already messed it up. God doesn't love you anymore. So do whatever you want. That is where majority of the world is. That's why they don't want to even look at the light. Because the light and all they're willing to see of the light is condemnation. That's all they're willing to see of the light. It's bright. It shines on my sin. And I'm going to hell, according to what I hear. And they know nothing of the grace of Jesus. They know nothing of him saying, and that makes you like every other sinner in the world. Now come to me and let me heal you. They don't hear that message. Satan doesn't want them to hear that message. But it is true. It is very true. Okay. There's a lot of good stuff here. Randy made fun of me and said I wasn't be able to even get out of chapter 2. He's probably right, so that's super unfortunate. Okay, so therefore, it's right here, he had to be made like his brethren. Oh, nope, we're already past this. We're lower down. Therefore, he had to be made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful, faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. So now he confirms what we already know, that he had to be. He had to be made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. I don't know exactly how that works. I don't. But what I do is I know I believe God. God says this, when I looked across the span of time and all the different ways that I could bring salvation to you, this was it. This is how we do it. And we do it by not just saying, I'm snapping my fingers and the devil is done and you're forgiven. Why would that not work? Because we wouldn't care. We'd say, great, I'm going to go sin. That's what we would do. Because it's what people do all the time when they have a misunderstanding of God's grace. Oh, you fixed it? I'm good? I'm gonna just go live my life in sin, and we're good. It doesn't change you. So he says, the only way that I'm going to change you is I have to come put on flesh and let you kill me. And then you'll be sorry for your sins. Then you will change and realize both how heinous you are and how good I am. That's what the cross does. Nothing else could have done it. And so he had to be made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. So there's this half of him being this merciful and faithful one to us, that we could relate to him, and also to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For since he himself was tempted in that which he has suffered, he is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. And I skipped a verse here. I didn't mean to. It's a very important verse. So he says this down here in 18, but he's actually already hinted at it back here in verse 16. And he just kind of repeats it. For assuredly he does not give help to angels, he gives help to the descendants of Abraham. Now, the descendants of Abraham is everyone who comes to Jesus. Everyone who comes to the one who fulfills the promise to Abraham. And the promise to Abraham was Christ. And so whoever falls before Jesus, the one who was originally promised to Abraham, and that he has come and fulfilled all things pertaining to God, then that is who he is trying to save. It's not just Jews. Through Abraham, it is everyone, all nations that are blessed. So, for since he himself was tempted in which he has suffered, he is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. Okay, angels, it seems like, are not tempted the same way that humans are. Now, I don't think it's right to say angels aren't tempted. Why would I say that? Because they fell. They fell with the devil. He obviously tempted them, but he tempted them with heavenly temptation. As in, they're already in the glory of God. I have no idea what that kind of level of temptation even looks like or what it sounds like. But they don't seem to be tempted in the same way that we do, or suffer from it in the same way that we do. As in, a human trying to tempt an angel, they would like flick them and be like, go away. What are you doing? You're being weird. It's like a gnat to them. They're just sitting here. I don't think humans have that kind of power over angels, but something of deity, or, well, deity didn't do it. Something below deity, but something very powerful, like Satan, saying, oh, we could really be like God. Oh, I could do better if you serve me. Whatever that looks like. Well, then they're saying, well, that sounds pretty good. I think I'd listen to that. Well, Jesus doesn't suffer from the temptations of angels. He suffered from the same temptations of you. Because we're not tempted like angels would be tempted. Not in the same regard. And so Jesus coming and putting on flesh and blood and being tempted like I am tempted affects me. It strengthens my prayers. Lord, you know. You know how much this hurts. You know how much I keep struggling with this. You know the shame that I'm feeling right now. You know the circle that I'm in and that I can't get out of. I need you. I need you. That's what Jesus does for us. So we're out of time. Just the first 6 verses of Hebrews 3. Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider Jesus. That's what he's pointing to. It's what he's been pointing to. Sorry. Excuse me. That was to tell me it's 10:15. So consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was in all his house. For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses. But just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. So that's all going to sound, we're not going to try to even open that up. But what I want you to get is he's starting to bring up some things, right? He's saying, consider Jesus. Consider him. And then he's calling him the apostle and the high priest of our confession. Then he's starting to bring up Moses. And he's talking about the house. And he's going to be making a very powerful point. And now he's moving from the angels to what do you think he's moving to now? Huh? Us. Sure, absolutely. And so we see that a part of what he's